The Galactic Navy's Chamber of Strategic Assessment was silent, all eyes fixed on the holographic display, showing a turbulent region of space near the far edge of the Confederacy's domain. Tiny rifts pulsed in mesmerizing but unsettling patterns, growing a fraction larger with every reading. Commander Mavic Thor, who had served in the Navy for over 2 decades, clasped his thick, four-fingered hand behind his back and tried not to let his posture betray his anxiety. It wasn't the rifts themselves that concerned him the most. He had encountered cosmic threats more than once in his career, but the fact that he was about to embark on a mission with the Navy's newly instituted Human Unconventional Solutions Officer. And everyone knew what that meant. Officially, Lieutenant Avery Ava Song was just another officer in the chain of command, albeit a relatively new one. Unofficially, she was exactly the sort of person who walked into a room, listened politely to the standard solutions, and then uttered that single cursed phrase that inevitably led to some borderline insane fix. It's probably a bad idea, but Mavic had read through her file before meeting her. He'd read about how she had saved an entire orbital colony by accidentally turning a routine terraforming device into a volcano pressure release system. He'd also read about how said system nearly vaporized half of the settlement before it finally stabilized the planet's crust. She was awarded 3 commendations and 3 reprimands at once, and the official record had concluded with the words, "Recommended for special assignment," due to repeated demonstration of unorthodox solutions. The Galactic Navy, in its wisdom, had decided to create a brand new position for humans like her, presumably so they could keep an eye on them. Or so Mavic surmised. He exhaled slowly, flicking a glance at the glowing representation of the cosmic rifts on the holographic table. They were forming in an otherwise unremarkable system near the far rim of the galaxy, in a territory once used by the Makari species as an energy-harvesting outpost. Rumor had it that the Makari left the place centuries ago. Now, readings suggested that the outpost was operational again, or at least partially functional, and that the machinery had begun to cause bizarre space-time disruptions in its vicinity. The possibilities range from mildly dangerous to catastrophically unstable, especially if the phenomenon kept spreading. The swirling lights on the display felt hypnotic if you stared too long, so Mavic cleared his throat and turned his gaze away. The Chamber of Strategic Assessment concluded that the 12th Fleet, under Mavic's command, would investigate, contain, and if needed, neutralize whatever was going on. The mission instructions were straightforward. Secure the area, gather data, attempt standard protocols for reversing unregulated dimensional expansions, and, if all else failed, keep the situation stable until reinforcements arrived. A standard enough assignment, except a single line at the bottom read, Human Unconventional Solutions Officer Assigned, Lieutenant Avery Song. Authorization Code, HU2. Mavic had swallowed hard when he saw it, but there was no refusing a direct order. Besides, he had to admit, in the event standard approaches failed, it was rumored that no species was better at improvisational, borderline chaotic solutions than humans. An hour after receiving his orders, Mavic was standing on the main deck of the flagship, reading through a summary of Ava's background. He kept scrolling, eyes bulging at the impressive ratio of improbable successes to near disasters. He noted her repeated use of devices that were never intended for the tasks to which she put them. Terraformers used as climate bombs. It worked out eventually, but still, shield generators that doubled as wave disruptors, or a thruster engine converted into a subspace booster shot to push a distress beacon across half a sector in 2 minutes. It seemed every grand victory was accompanied by a hair-raising detail about how close it had come to annihilating all involved. Mavic couldn't tell if he was supposed to admire her or fear her. Maybe both. When Lieutenant Song finally walked into his briefing chamber, Mavic was surprised by how slight she appeared. He'd expected a physically imposing figure, someone that matched the outsized legends swirling around the rumor mill. Instead, she was of average height, with short-cropped hair, bright, curious eyes, and an affable grin that immediately made Mavic suspicious. One thing he'd learned while dealing with humans, a grin like that often meant they were hatching plans that most beings would classify as dangerously impulsive. She saluted. Lieutenant Avery's song. Reporting for duty, sir. Mavic nodded, returning the gesture with a quick, formal flick of his palm. Welcome aboard. I understand you've been briefed on our situation. He gestured to the holographic display behind him, which was busy rendering the latest data from the Makari outpost. Cosmic rifts, possible dimensional tears, and an abandoned station that might be partly reactivated. Ava placed her hands behind her back in a stance that would have looked perfectly respectful if not for the gleam of excitement dancing in her eyes. Yes, sir. I've seen the data. The readings indicate that the rifts are expanding by approximately 0.03 parsecs every hour, though it fluctuates. The Makari equipment is apparently centuries old, so it could be malfunctioning or it could be doing exactly what it was built to do. Mavic scowled. And what was it built to do? The Makari left no records. Well, she said, they were always rumored to have dabbled in advanced zero-point energy extraction. The theory is that their tech could siphon massive amounts of energy from subspace or from the boundary regions of normal space-time. If it's turned on without proper regulation, it might be tearing little holes in the universe. She shrugged, almost as if discussing a mild inconvenience. In short, it's probably a very bad situation. The commander inhaled, reminding himself that she was the expert in weird human brilliance. Still, he was going to rely on standard procedures first. If standard procedures worked, maybe they wouldn't have to resort to the dreaded phrase that every alien in the Navy had learned to fear. We'll do a thorough reconnaissance, Mavic said. We'll send a few drones, see if we can glean how the station is operating. Then we'll try conventional disruptor protocols. Perhaps we can shut the machinery down or realign it. No need to do anything drastic. Ava's grin widened just a bit. Understood, sir. By the time the 12th Fleet arrived in the region, the rifts had multiplied. On the main view screen, a swirl of violet and green energy flickered across the void, punctuated by ephemeral lightning arcs that made the sensors glitch. A smaller corvette launched a set of unmanned drones to get a closer look. Within 10 minutes, half of them were lost. Telemetry ended abruptly as they crossed certain thresholds, either devoured by the anomalies or flung violently across space. One drone managed to survive just long enough to transmit images of the Makari outpost, a spherical structure bristling with spindly, half-broken pylons that glowed ominously. The old technology was still online, in some capacity, and from the looks of it, dangerously overloaded. Mavic ordered a meeting of his senior officers in the flagship's central conference room. Among them were his insectoid first officer, Commander Jaskrit, whose entire species had a rather direct approach to problem-solving that frequently involved using overwhelming firepower, and a slender avian tactical specialist with shimmering green plumage named Thalios. Ava was present as well, seated at the far end of the table, quietly studying readouts on a datapad. Commander Jaskrit clicked her mandibles. I propose we isolate the outpost behind a series of stabilized force fields, then bombard it with long-range quantum torpedoes. If we tear it apart, the anomalies may dissipate. I've reviewed that scenario, Thalios said. The problem is that we don't fully grasp the internal workings of the outpost. Blowing it up might cause a chain reaction that supercharges the rifts. For all we know, a direct assault could accelerate the damage. Mavic turned to Ava. She was scribbling notes on her pad, which likely contained all sorts of half-formed strategies. Lieutenant Song, he said, what's your take? Can we do something less destructive? She peered up. Well, standard procedure says we should try to manually power down the outpost or reconfigure it. Possibly we can do that by linking our disruptor beams to the outpost's central core, forcing it offline. But the data from the drones suggests the outpost is half in and half out of normal space. Our ships might not be able to get close enough without suffering critical damage. She paused. There's another possibility. We could try a remote infiltration. We have infiltration drones built for hazardous environments. Let me guess, Jaskrit interrupted with a sarcastic rasp. The infiltration drones that we use in emergent star scenarios? The ones that have only a 30% survival rate. Ava nodded with a slightly rueful grin. Those are the ones. but we can upgrade them with a subspace shield mod we used in a prior operation. I helped develop that after an unfortunate meltdown on a colony. But it worked eventually, I promise. Mavic noticed Jaskrit's antenna quiver in mild alarm. The insectoid had read the same logs about human involvement in meltdown scenarios. He decided to push forward anyway. We'll attempt the infiltration drone approach. Let's keep the torpedoes as a contingency. We're not blowing anything up unless we absolutely must. He paused. Lieutenant Song, you've got 12 hours to figure out how to reconfigure those drones. Start with the subspace mod you mentioned. Her eyes lit up. Yes, sir. Right away, sir. She hopped out of her chair and hurried off, leaving behind an air of anticipation that made everyone else in the room uneasy. Mavic watched her go and reminded himself that a well-coordinated plan was always better than a last-second, half-mad scheme. If everything went smoothly, there would be no need for that dreaded human phrase. Over the next few hours, Ava and a team of engineers sweated over the infiltration drones in one of the fleet's hangar bays. She insisted on combining a subspace shield array with advanced scanning protocols so the drones could move in and remotely shut down the outpost's power core. The engineering team was mostly a calm, by-the-book group, and each new idea from Ava made them glance at each other nervously. When asked for the official schematics of her subspace shield mod, Ava simply tapped at a small handheld device. I lost the original files, so I'm reconstructing them from memory. And from partial logs in the colony, 12 meltdown archives. Don't worry. If we run into problems, we'll improvise. Sometime around hour 9, the engineering deck started trembling. The newly installed shield array had begun resonating with the docking clamps. A feedback loop threatened to blow out the entire hangar's energy couplings. Ava ducked under a console, yanked out 3 cables, and plugged them back and reversed, half laughing, half cursing. Somehow, that stabilized the system. The engineers stood there in awe, though they still asked themselves whether she had any clue which cables to pull or if it was pure guesswork. She assured them it was something in between, which did little to ease their minds. At the 12-hour mark, Mavic entered the hangar to check on the progress. He found Ava leaning against a tall crate, sipping a protein drink. She looked exhausted but triumphant. Behind her, half a dozen infiltration drones hovered in a neat line, softly humming with new shield systems attached to their frames. A faint shimmer suggested they might just survive the turbulent environment. She offered Mavic a salute. We're good to go, sir. Well, mostly good. There's a 10% chance the drones could short-circuit on launch, and a 15% chance they'll go haywire near the rifts. So, I guess that means 75% success odds. Could be worse. Mavic gave her a weary but appreciative nod. It will have to do. Let's get them launched. The infiltration drones were deployed one by one, each jettisoned into the swirling field of anomalies. 2 of them immediately vanished from sensors, presumably destroyed. The others pressed forward, weaving through arcs of distorted energy. After a tense few minutes, the survivors reached the spherical Makari outpost. Through a flickering live feed, the 12th Fleet's command center watched as the drones latched onto an exterior port and began hacking the outpost's ancient systems. Data scrolled across the main viewer, signaling partial infiltration. For a few precious minutes, everything looked promising. Then the drones sent back a final burst of telemetry. Outpost operational. Power core running at 225% capacity. Structural integrity compromised. Attempting remote shutdown. Attempt fail. Attempt partial override. Dimensional energy spiking. And then the feed went dark. Mavic cursed under his breath. Report. He barked at the sensor officer. The officer's voice trembled. We've lost the drones, Commander. The outpost is now emitting increased dimensional flux. The rifts are growing at double their previous rate. At the back of the command deck, Ava let out a quiet, defeated groan. Jaskrit whirled around and clicked her mandibles in frustration. All we've done is worsen the problem. Mavic pursed his lips, forced himself to remain calm, and turned to Ava. Lieutenant Song, do you have any immediate suggestions? She hesitated, her brow creasing in that deeply thoughtful way humans had when they were about to propose something that was either genius or catastrophically ill-advised. I might have an idea, she said softly. Jaskrit snorted. That phrase is a step away from, it's probably a bad idea, but if that's where you're going with this, maybe we should just shoot the outpost with torpedoes. Ava gave the insectoid a thin smile. Actually, I was going to say it might be better to board the outpost directly. Send a specialized team. Attempt a manual shutdown from inside. That's suicide, Thalios interjected. Our ships would be ripped apart trying to dock with that station's external ports. The anomaly field is too violent. We wouldn't make it halfway. Ava rubbed at her neck, looking both embarrassed and excited. We might not have to dock. I'm thinking of a short-range dimensional slip, basically teleportation, except we rely on the rifts. On energies to help us. If we calibrate a slip teleporter properly, we could jump a small squad right into the outpost's central corridors. In theory, at least. Silence fell across the command deck. Mavic stared at her. Slip teleportation using the anomaly's energy is untested, at best. Are you certain it won't kill anyone who tries it? Not certain at all, she replied. We'd have to conduct real-time recalibrations to avoid losing a person's molecules in the void. But we only need a small group. If they succeed, they can manually power down the system. If they fail, well, it's not like our infiltration drones are working out. And if we keep waiting, the rifts will expand to devour the entire sector. Jaskrit slapped a chitinous forelimb on the console. You realize what you're proposing is reckless. We might lose the entire team, or cause the outpost to go critical. Ava's jaw set. Yes, Commander. It's probably a bad idea, but she stopped when she noticed the entire deck flinch at once. It's the only way we can stop this from escalating further. She tried for a calmer tone. Look, we can keep the teleport attempt as controlled as possible. We build a small teleporter pad, anchor it to the flagship's more stable region of subspace, and target a known corridor inside the outpost using partial data from the infiltration drones. Once we're in, we manually override or shut down the Makari core. I'm guessing they have some kind of control console near the center. Then we slip back out. Mavic closed his eyes. He could almost feel a headache forming. He was not by nature a gambler, but every standard approach had already failed. The infiltration drones were destroyed, torpedoing the station might blow half the sector, and the anomalies kept spreading. One look around the deck confirmed that no one else had a better plan. With resignation, he exhaled. All right, Lieutenant. You have clearance to set up this slip teleport infiltration. You'll lead the mission, and you can pick 2 volunteers. We'll proceed with caution. Ava saluted. Thank you, sir. I'll do everything I can to keep us alive. He simply nodded, wishing there was time to reflect on how bizarre it was to rely on a possibly insane plan. But that was the reality of dealing with humans. You either let them try their improbable solutions, or you watch the crisis spin out of control. Sometimes both. Within 2 hours, the flagship's engineering team had constructed a jury-rigged teleporter pad in one of the cargo bays. It stood about half a meter off the floor, ringed by swirling lights that indicated the integrated subspace anchor. Thick cables trailed across the deck, plugged into half a dozen power consoles. Ava tested the calibration by tossing a small container into the ring. The container instantly vanished. Moments later, it reappeared behind some crates, slightly scorched but more or less intact. She called that a success. Her volunteer squad consisted of one plucky ensign from mammalian species known for their robust constitutions, and a Makari historian named Velteris, who had studied old Makari technology for decades. Velteris was not much of a fighter, but if they made it inside, he might be able to interpret the outpost control consoles. As they triple-checked their gear, Mavic arrived in the cargo bay to give them a last pep talk. The commander's broad shoulders looked especially tense, and his voice came out tight. You're to find the power core, gather as much data as possible, and shut it down. If it can't be shut down, sabotage it so it doesn't keep ripping holes in the universe. But for all that is sacred, do not blow the entire station to pieces. Understood, understood, Ava said, hoisting a portable hacking device over her shoulder. She gave Velteris a reassuring pat on the arm. He looked terrified, but his curiosity and sense of duty kept him standing on the teleporter pad. The mammalian ensign, Tella, was fiddling with a handheld scanner that beeped ominously. Ava typed in final coordinates at a console. Coordinates locked. I'll keep comms open as long as I can. We might have to realign the teleporter from inside. So, Commander, if we radio that we're ready to come back, you'll need to adjust for our position shift. Mavik's expression made it clear he wasn't thrilled at all. Just get back in one piece, he said. She nodded. We'll try. Without further ado, she pressed the activation switch. The teleporter ring glowed, and in a dazzling burst of twisting light, the three of them vanished. On the flagship sensors, the moment of teleportation coincided with a surge in the anomaly. One console promptly erupted in sparks, forcing a technician to shut it down. Mavik stared at the cargo bay, which was now empty where the team had stood. He let out a shaky breath, turned to Jaskrit, who had just arrived to witness the chaos. All we can do now, Mavik muttered, is hope that little magic trick of yours actually works. Inside the Makari outpost, Ava, Velteris, and Tella materialized in a corridor that flickered between normal metal plating and warped dimensional edges. A wave of nausea hit them as the deck beneath their feet rippled. For a moment, it looked as though each person's outline was smeared across the air, like a glitching hologram. Then the effect subsided, leaving them panting but intact. The corridor walls hummed with the same ominous glow they had seen from the drone's vantage point, dotted with Makari script and control panels. Velteris immediately rushed to examine one of the panels, muttering, "Remarkable. This script is centuries old. Some lines seem to be warnings, meltdown, subspace inversion." He stared at it in a mix of awe and dread. "It definitely looks meltdown-ish to me," Ava said, glancing down the corridor. One direction ended in a sealed hatch. The other led deeper into the swirling lights. The air crackled with stray energy, and the dryness in her mouth told her that the environment wasn't entirely stable. "Vel, see if you can figure out how to open this hatch. Tella, run a scan of the local structure. We need to locate the main power center." Tella was already tapping at her handheld scanner. "I'm getting a reading about 30 meters that way, but there's a void reading in between, a literal gap in the station's geometry. We might have to bypass it somehow." Ava frowned. "A gap in the station's geometry? Like a chunk of corridor is just gone?" "That's what the scanner suggests." Tella pointed at an overhead grate. "We might go around if we can climb upward. My species is decent at climbing, but I'm not sure about you two." Ava rolled her shoulders. "We'll figure it out. Vel, any luck with that hatch?" The historian was pressing holographic buttons on the Makari panel. "It's jammed with some kind of security override. Possibly the system went into a meltdown lockdown. We might need to force it." "Stand back." Ava recognized that tone, the one that preceded a classic human solution. She rummaged in her kit. The standard infiltration approach was to slice the door's control circuit. But the door was bathed in some swirling energy that might make that slicing a hazard. Instead, she found a small device that could emit a localized EMP burst, enough to short out the door's locking mechanism. However, she also knew that in an environment with unstable dimensional energies, an EMP might do more than just short out a door. She eyed the pulsating walls and turned back to Vel. "How about I just set this to minimal output? If we go too high, we risk blowing out the corridor." She gave a wry grin. "And that would be a bit more excitement than we need right now." Vel nodded nervously. Tella stepped back. Ava placed the EMP device near the hatch's control panel and set it to low power. A hum, a slight pop, and the lights on the door flickered. With a hiss, it slid open. Beyond lay a half-collapsed corridor. Fragments of metal plating hung in midair as if gravity worked selectively. Ahead was a deep chasm that dropped into swirling energy. It looked like part of the station floor had simply broken away, leaving them a 2-meter gap to cross. On the far side was more corridor, leading deeper in. Tella inched forward, scanning. "That energy below us will likely tear us apart if we fall in. We could jump, but if we slip, it's not a nice way to go." Ava eyed the gap, tested the floor plating stability. She saw that some overhead pipes, might support a person's weight. After a moment, she shrugged off her gear bag and fished out a length of reinforced cable. She tied one end around a protruding piece of framework, then tossed the rest across the gap. Tella deftly caught it. Their plan was to anchor the cable so each of them could slide across, hopefully not plunging into the swirling unknown. Valteris pressed himself to the corridor wall, trying to breathe steadily. We're insane, you know. The Makari definitely had safer ways to navigate this place. But they also presumably didn't let their station degrade for centuries or toy with the fabric of reality. Ava just smiled. This is still safer than some things I've done. She nodded for Tella to test the cable's tension. The ensign braced herself, took a short leap, and reached the far side with surprising agility. Then she anchored the cable on a twisted support beam, giving a thumbs up. Ava was next, inching hand over hand. The floor seemed to moan beneath her boots, so she used as little pressure as possible. She felt the swirl of dimensional energy beneath her, saw the flickers of distorted space. She realized that if this station was allowed to keep malfunctioning, it might tear open a monstrous gateway, big enough to devour an entire sector. That certainly motivated her to keep going. At last, she reached the other side, followed by Valteris, who muttered frantic prayers to any deity that might be listening. The corridor continued for several meters, then opened into a wide chamber. Overhead, multiple conduits crisscrossed like a mechanical spiderweb. In the center of the chamber stood a massive cylindrical apparatus, presumably part of the power core. Lights blinked in a chaotic pattern, and arcs of energy danced across random surfaces. A transparent console, shaped like an upright pillar, displayed Makari script that scrolled so fast even Valteris couldn't keep up. Tella stepped forward, scanning vigorously. My device is picking up a reservoir of subspace energy behind that cylinder. The intensity is off the charts. Vel brushed a hand across the console, his eyes widening at the ancient language. This is the main control interface, I think. The Makari used modular keys. If I can decipher the input sequence, we can shut this all down. His fingers hovered, then pressed a few shapes. The console beeped, but the text scrolled even faster. Ava readjusted the strap on her portable hacking device. She recognized that Vel's knowledge of the language was crucial, but sometimes you needed a brute force approach. Mind if I try my infiltration rig? The historian huffed. Just be careful. If we jam the wrong command into the core, we might blow us all up. Nonetheless, he stepped aside. Ava plugged a small interface pad into the console's data port. The device blinked uncertainly, trying to handshake with centuries-old Makari code. She toggled a few settings. The core's humming began to rise in pitch, and a swirl of greenish lightning danced along the floor. The entire station trembled. Ava clenched her jaw, typed in a quick patch routine, and tried to bypass some of the meltdown locks. The console beeped disapprovingly. Then a Makari script flared across the entire display in glaring orange. What did it say? Ava asked Vel, who was squinting at the readout. He swallowed. It says, Power core overload in progress. Dimensional meltdown imminent. Evacuate immediately. That's not encouraging. Great. She tried another infiltration approach. We can do this. We just need to override the meltdown protocol and manually ramp the station's power down to nominal. She tapped furiously on her device, ignoring the sparks that flew from the console. Tella had to duck as an overhead conduit spat out a shower of energy. Vel tried pressing a few more Makari glyphs in tandem with Ava's hacking. The cylinder in the center of the room pulsed, and for a moment, the entire station seemed to flicker. They glimpsed open space beyond the walls, as if the station's integrity itself was unraveling. At the same time, back on the flagship, the sensors spiked in panic. Mavic hovered over the operator's shoulder, reading the data. The station's meltdown had accelerated. The dimensional rifts were stretching outward in shock waves, threatening not only the 12th Fleet, but also a neighboring inhabited planet. He ground his teeth, wishing there was some direct action he could take. Jaskrit hissed, "Commander, we have to act. If the infiltration fails, this meltdown might take out half the system. Mavic cursed under his breath. We can't blow it up. We'd only worsen the meltdown. Our best bet is to give them more time. He eyed the cargo bay teleporter pad. What if we try to extend the subspace anchor? Maybe they can still get out after they do what needs to be done. Let's do that. The insectoid first officer gave a curt nod, and they hurried to find a way to boost the teleporter's range. They tried feeding more power from the flagship's main reactor. They attempted to dial into the same corridor that Ava's team had jumped into, but the meltdown pulses scrambled the signals. The deck shook repeatedly as each new pulse hammered the region. Everyone on the flagship braced themselves with every rumble, dreading the possibility that they might see the station tear itself, and the infiltration team apart at any second. Inside the power core chamber, Ava's infiltration device spewed nonsense across its screen. She let out a frustrated groan. We're hitting a meltdown lock. It's rewriting itself faster than we can override. She stepped back, took a breath, and tried to think. When faced with a meltdown on the colony, she had discovered that the standard procedure was worthless. Instead, she managed some wild trick with the terraformer, venting the magma flows in controlled bursts. That success had begun with the phrase that made the entire Navy cringe. And here she was, confronted with an even bigger meltdown. Her eyes narrowed. Vel, is there a way to reroute the meltdown so it vents dimensional energy outward in small pulses, rather than building to one catastrophic explosion? Vel blinked. That would require rewriting the meltdown protocols themselves, possibly forcing the meltdown to break apart in a series of smaller dimensional distortions instead of one big rift. The Makari never designed it that way. We'd be improvising on centuries-old code in a language that's half lost. Right. That means it's probably a bad idea, but she paused. Tella closed her eyes, braced for the worst. Vel gave a feeble nod. Ava finished. It might be our best shot. If we can make the meltdown happen in a controlled sequence, we can stop a total cosmic tear from forming. How do we do that? Tella asked, sounding half terrified, half intrigued. Ava pulled a battered tablet out of her hacking kit. I have a partial meltdown rewriting script from the old colony fiasco. It's not meant for Makari code, but if I feed it in, maybe we can trick the system into an organized meltdown. Vel, you figure out the Makari commands we need to neutralize once we force the meltdown to fragment. Then Tella, we coordinate those commands with the infiltration device. Then we pray the station doesn't just blow up. She plugged her tablet into the console, ignoring the furious sparks that leaped from the interface. At that moment, an alarm tone shrieked throughout the chamber, followed by a swirl of sickly green light along the cylinder. The meltdown was racing to its climax. Vel typed frantically on the console. Tella linked her scanner to the infiltration rig, bridging the languages. Ava set her meltdown rewriting script to run. It spat out error messages for half a minute, during which the entire station threatened to warp inside out. Bits of the floor crumbled and disintegrated, forcing them to shuffle around. Finally, Ava hammered the execute command on her device. For a split second, everything froze. Then the meltdown alarm cut off. Lights flickered. The giant cylinder in the center of the chamber groaned, and arcs of energy began circling the top in rhythmic pulses, almost as if the meltdown was happening in stages. The swirling anomalies outside seemed to throb in sync with these pulses. Vel's eyes were wide. It's fracturing. The meltdown is fracturing. I need to input the neutralizing codes. Tella, feed me that translation. He and Tella typed in a hurry. Each keystroke made the station's meltdown break further into discrete pulses. The entire place convulsed as leftover energy found new channels. Over the comm, a static riddle connection to the 12th Fleet opened. Mavic's voice crackled in. Lieutenant Song, do you read? The meltdown flux is spiking, but it looks more segmented. We're seeing partial collapses. Are you in control of this? Ava forced a laugh, though she felt anything but calm. Working on it, sir. Stand by. Her eyes flicked to Vel. Almost there. Almost, he panted. This last command should finalize the meltdown cycle as a series of small collapses rather than one big universe-ripping tear. He typed it in. The console beeped. A final wave of swirling lights enveloped the chamber. Ava, Tella, and Vel clung to whatever solid structure they could as the station trembled violently. They felt certain this was the end. Then, with a cacophonous hum that vibrated through their bones, the meltdown pulses triggered a cascade of collapses that fizzled out in a chain reaction around them. The swirling anomalies vanished from the immediate corridor, replaced by blasts of crackling air that dissipated. The main cylinder's lights flicked from a frenetic glow to a low, steady pulse. And then, miraculously, it all settled into a quiet hush. The meltdown had been neutralized, though not in any official manual's recommended manner. For a moment, none of them moved. They just stared at one another, breathing heavily. On the console, a series of Makari glyphs appeared. Vel read them aloud. Meltdown averted. System stabilized. Manual override recommended for maintenance procedures. We did it, he whispered. Ava closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. Thank all the cosmic architects, she said, paraphrasing a phrase she'd heard one of her alien colleagues use. She activated her comm. Commander Thor, meltdown neutralized. The rifts should be collapsing. We're going to find a stable area to attempt a slip teleport back. Static crackled. Then Mavik's relieved voice broke through. We see the anomalies shrinking. Good work, Lieutenant. Hurry back. This entire region is still precarious. She glanced around at the battered chamber. We'll do our best, sir. Stand by. It took them nearly half an hour to retrace their path. The corridors were calmer now, but debris and collapsed segments made the journey difficult. One hallway that had existed on their way in was now twisted, inaccessible. Thankfully, the station was no longer convulsing with meltdown pulses, so they didn't fear an imminent cosmic tear. Still, the structure's age and partial disrepair could kill them at any moment. Twice, Tella had to stop and rig improvised supports to prevent a total cave-in. Meanwhile, Ava kept checking her gear, ensuring she had enough power left for the slip teleport. The meltdown might have altered the local dimensional flux, so the original coordinates would be worthless. They'd have to rely on raw scanning data to find a stable point to jump from. Vel, clambering over a fallen beam, asked, "How many times have you done something like this?" Because I keep hearing about how humans solve impossible crises. This definitely qualifies. She wiped sweat from her forehead. I've done enough to know it never gets any less nerve-wracking. She paused. And trust me, I'd love to solve these problems the normal, documented way. But half the time, the normal methods don't work. Vel gave a wry chuckle. At least we're still alive. Eventually, they reached a corridor that seemed intact. Ava set down her teleporter anchor device, adjusting the subspace calibrations. She radioed the 12th Fleet. We're attempting slip teleport from here. We'll broadcast a beacon. You'll have to lock onto it, Commander. Ready? Ready, came Mavik's voice. Tella tossed a small emitter onto the floor, letting it project a stable bubble of subspace. They all crowded inside the bubble, hearts pounding. Ava typed a final sequence. The corridor blurred. The dimensional energies swirled around them. The last thing they saw was the battered interior of the Makari station flickering away as the slip drive engaged. They reappeared in the flagship's cargo bay, stumbling onto the teleporter pad. Sparks flew from overhead lighting, and the entire deck shook from leftover anomaly quakes. But they were back. Mavik was there, arms folded, relief etched across his face. He barked at a medic to check them over, then gave Ava a curt nod that somehow conveyed both gratitude and exasperation. On the main view screen, the swirling rifts in space were shrinking. Segmented meltdown pulses had scattered the anomalies, now collapsing them into harmless pockets of subspace turbulence. Already the sensors showed that the region was stabilizing. The immediate danger was over. As the hours passed, the 12th Fleet lingered to supervise final repairs, scanning for any lingering tears or anomalies. The Makari outpost, battered but no longer meltdown-prone, was left under a remote caretaker drone, this time one that didn't try to hack the meltdown codes, only to observe and keep the place powered down. Mavik's after-action report was going to be a doozy. He could already imagine the conversation with the higher-ups. Yes, we neutralized the meltdown by forcing it into a fractal meltdown sequence, courtesy of an improvised script that never existed in official protocols. He almost felt sorry for the scribes who had to parse that. A few days later, Mavik met with Ava in his ready room. He had a datapad with 2 forms on it. One was a commendation letter for preventing a catastrophic cosmic tear. The other was a formal reprimand for deploying a slip teleport infiltration. Officially, the Navy discouraged that. He set them both in front of her. "Which do you want first?" he asked. She sighed. "I'll take the commendation first. It's nice to end on a sour note, so the next mission can only be brighter." He chuckled, handing her the commendation. "You and your team saved a lot of lives. That meltdown might have swallowed an entire star system if you hadn't found a way to break it apart. And we'd never have managed it with a normal infiltration or heavy firepower." Then he pushed the reprimand her way. "But it was also deeply unorthodox and nearly got you killed. That probably a bad idea approach will haunt me in my sleep." She accepted the reprimand without complaint. "Understand, sir. Believe me, I'd love to fix these problems more systematically, but half the time, we run out of time for that." He nodded. "I know. It's precisely why the Navy started assigning humans to these roles, even though we also dread hearing your creative solutions." He paused. "Whatever the case, we'll be on standby in this region for a bit longer, making sure the meltdown residue doesn't flare up. Then we'll likely get new orders." She saluted, prepared to leave. He gave a tired smile. "Good work, Lieutenant. Now go get some rest." Ava turned to the door, recalling how close they'd come to disaster, how the meltdown threatened to unravel subspace, how Tella had nearly fallen to her doom, and how the infiltration device shorted out right at the last second, but somehow still worked. She had to admit, it was downright terrifying sometimes. And yet, a tiny part of her thrilled at the success. She stepped into the corridor, saw a few passing crew members from different species. Many offered her respectful nods. Others looked at her with a mixture of apprehension and awe, as if uncertain whether to congratulate or avoid her. News traveled fast through the Navy. Already, rumors circulated about how the 12th Fleet solved the meltdown using a plan that started with that infamous human catchphrase. Jaskrit had told Mavik in private, "We're adding another data point to the phenomenon. Humain propose a borderline suicidal approach, and somehow it works." Mavik had responded that it wasn't luck. Ava was highly competent. But Jaskrit still believed there was something deeper. Maybe the universe had a hidden sense of humor, one that responded to humans in improbable ways. Within a week, everything stabilized. The meltdown zone had quieted. The rifts shrank to negligible distortions. Mavik prepared a final holo-conference with Galactic Navy headquarters. They demanded to know how standard protocols had failed. They wanted to see the logs, the meltdown rewriting script, the infiltration device. Mavik answered as honestly as he could, without painting Ava as a total lunatic. The admirals listened with stony faces and occasionally jotted notes. In the end, they recognized the necessity, praised the 12th Fleet for preventing a cosmic disaster, and concluded the session with a cautionary statement. Ensure that future endeavors comply more closely with standard guidelines. It was the same statement they always gave after a successful but unorthodox human-led mission. Mavik almost laughed at how predictable that was. In the meantime, the entire crew had a chance to catch its breath. A small celebration was held in the mess hall. Some of the non-human crew members engaged in their traditions. The insectoids crackled their mandibles in a rhythmic pattern, while Thalios' avian colleagues performed a short dance. Humans offered snacks in the corner, some questionable pastries that half the galaxy's species found baffling. Throughout the festivities, the phrase, "It's probably a bad idea," but became an affectionate punchline, repeated with either laughter or a slight shudder. But no rest lasted forever. The call came through from headquarters. An unusual signature was detected in the Cygnus sector, potentially an early-stage quantum filament cluster. Mavic got the alert in his personal quarters, scanning the data. The official protocol for quantum filaments was to observe from a safe distance, gather data, and let them dissipate if possible. But filaments sometimes congealed into subspace storms that threatened entire trade routes. He left his quarters and headed for the command deck, feeling the old tension creep back into his shoulders. He found Ava in the corridor. She was reading the same alert on a handheld device. She glanced up, excited and worried. "Commander, have you seen this? Could be big trouble if the filaments are forming near inhabited worlds." Mavic nodded. "Yes, I've seen. The standard approach is observation, caution, and a lot of waiting. The Confederacy's official stance is to do nothing unless the filaments approach a star system." Ava tapped her foot, a human gesture that Mavic recognized as a sign of restless energy. "And if it does approach a system, we might have to do something more hands-on." My mind's already spinning with a few possibilities. He let out a quiet moan, halfway between amusement and dread. "Lieutenant, for the sake of what's left of my nerves, don't say that phrase yet. Let us at least do the standard checks." She grinned. "Oh, absolutely, Commander. Standard checks all the way." But there was a mischievous glint in her eyes. Mavic couldn't help but roll his own in response. They stepped onto the command deck, where Jaskrit and Thalios were analyzing the new data. The official guidelines instructed them to remain at safe distance, but the filaments might coalesce unpredictably. Everyone felt the unspoken awareness that if things spiraled out of control, a human approach might be needed again. Once more, Mavic found himself facing a cosmic challenge that no one fully understood. He stared at the swirling signature on the view screen. The memory of that meltdown fiasco was still too fresh. And yet, he also recalled Ava stepping up, risking her life in the Makari station, weaving a brand new solution out of half-broken code. Despite all the dread, it worked. Now, confronted with quantum filament data that defied conventional models, Mavic suspected the standard approach might once again prove insufficient. He suppressed a sigh and addressed the crew. "All right, everyone. Initiate scans. Let's see how these filaments behave." His gaze drifted to Ava's song, who was already prepping a side console with subspace flow readouts. "Lieutenant, run your analysis. And if you have any ideas." She looked up, her grin bright. "Yes, sir." He stopped mid-sentence, suddenly wary. "Just keep them to yourself for now, unless we truly need them." Ava laughed softly, a joyful sound that suggested she didn't take offense. "Of course, Commander. No need to panic yet. I'll keep my notes in the maybe pile." Mavic nodded, feeling a mix of relief and resignation. In the back of his mind, he suspected that before this was over, she would inevitably utter that dreaded phrase. And for all his experience, for all the caution the Navy hammered into him, he was starting to accept that this was just how humans operated. They tried normal procedures. They adhered to as many rules as they could. Then, when the universe threw something truly unprecedented in their faces, they improvised. By cosmic chance or cosmic humor, it often worked out, sometimes in ways no one could fully explain. Hours later, while the 12th Fleet established a stable orbit near the filaments region, Mavic retreated to his ready room to make a personal log. He stared at the blank screen, pondering how best to describe his evolving perspective. Finally, he keyed in a private entry. "The meltdown crisis near the Makari outpost is resolved, though not in a standard fashion. We owe that success to Lieutenant Avery Song and her terrifying yet effective approach. I've concluded that the human knack for borderline impossible solutions isn't a fluke. It's a genuine pattern that emerges whenever conventional logic fails. The admirals have yet to classify this phenomenon beyond relegating it to the human contingency addendum. But in my experience, humans, particularly the ones who say it's probably a bad idea but are the last line of defense against cosmic threats we barely comprehend. I'd be lying if I said I'm entirely comfortable with it. Every time we rely on such plans, we court disaster. But in a galaxy full of anomalies and meltdown stations, maybe that's exactly what we need sometimes. A species crazy enough to punch the laws of physics in the nose and hope it flinches. As for me, I'll keep commanding by the book as best I can. Yet something tells me this quantum filament cluster is going to test us again. And if it does, I already know who'll step up with a wild solution. It's become clear by now, this is why the Galactic Navy dreads any plan that begins with, "It's probably a bad idea, but..." Because that plan might be the only thing standing between us and a gaping cosmic abyss. And because we know, deep down, it might just work. He saved the entry, leaned back, and closed his eyes, letting the tension drain. In the distance, he heard Ava giving instructions to a pair of junior officers, her voice lively and unashamedly confident. Mavic smiled to himself. With any luck, they'd have a peaceful resolution this time. But if not, the galaxy was in good hands, even if those hands sometimes had to smash a few rules to save the day. As the 12th Fleet powered up its scanning arrays and the quantum filaments began their slow, ominous coalescence, Commander Mavic Thor could only watch and wait for the moment when standard procedures inevitably came up short. And in that moment, he knew Lieutenant Song would be there, that unsettling grin on her face, ready to begin with the words everyone knew so well. Because that was the unofficial motto of humanity's entire role in the Galactic Navy these days. A single phrase that struck fear in admirals and anomalies alike, yet somehow continued to deliver the universe from certain doom.